Settle in, now dim the lights. Pull the blanket close, and let the hum of the night wrap gently around your thoughts. You're safe here, and there's no need to do anything at all, except listen. Tonight, we'll drift into the cobbled streets and candlelit corridors of the past, somewhere deep in the medieval world, where the taverns are loud, the alleyways quieter, and a brothel girl's life is not quite what you'd expect. If this calm journey helps you unwind, or if it carries you gently towards sleep, tap like and subscribe, but only if it feels right. Maybe even drop a sleepy comment. What part of history do you want to wander through next? Let's begin. Not with kings or castles, but with the soft rustle of linen skirts, the scent of hearth-smoked bread, and a life that history rarely pauses to remember. Here begins your brutal life. As a brothel woman in medieval times, a chill curled around the stone threshold as I woke that morning. What passed for morning in our part of town, anyway. The sun was shy, still buried behind soot-stained rooftops and the thick winter mist that clung to every wooden beam like a jealous ghost. I wriggled from beneath the rough wool blanket, its threads stiff with age and the faint scent of last night's sweat and ash. My back ached, not from luxury, but from straw-stuffed bedding that had long since lost its shape. That was my cradle, my stage, my battleground. I shared the cramped upper room with two others, Mirette and Ellen, both snoring softly, their faces pressed to what little warmth the bed offered. Funny how intimacy grows, not from love, but from proximity. We were close, like sisters, or prisoners. You might think life in a brothel was fire and flicker and silken whispers. Not quite, not for the likes of us. Our house was tucked into the lower quarter of the town, nestled between a fishmonger's stall and an apothecary that always smelled like boiled moss. No signs, no painted doors, just a tilted lantern by the entrance, red glass, always glowing like an ember that refused to die. Our Madame Elsbeth liked to say we were women of the town, which sounded nicer than what the bishop called us. But whatever the title, our days were long, and our nights even longer. And still, there was something oddly peaceful about it all. Maybe it was the predictability, or maybe, when the world expects nothing of you, there's a strange kind of freedom in that. Did you know that in 1351, during the height of the plague's aftermath, certain towns in Europe actually legalized brothels? Officials thought it might contain the urges of men and prevent other scenes. Imagine that chur body, regulated like a bakery. Not exactly the legacy they write on stained glass. But back to that morning. The coals in the hearth had died, leaving behind a soft hiss like a sleeping cat. I ran my fingers through the curls matted to my forehead, dipped a cloth into the chipped basin near the window, and splashed my face with icy water. That window overlooked the alley. Not much of a view, but still, I watched. A man limped by with a sack of turnips. A dog followed close, hopeful. Somewhere, a bell rang from the Tower 7 tolls. Time to sweep the floors before Elsbeth began her inspections. I often wondered what I would have done if I'd been born in a different family. A baker's daughter, maybe, or a weaver's niece. But bread goes stale, and cloth frays, and even those girls ended up with sore backs and endless chores. At least here, I was paid sort of. In food, mostly. And the occasional copper coin I could stash away beneath the floorboard, wrapped in a linen scrap stitched with my mother's initials. What would you have done, I wonder, if you'd been born in 14th century Bruges, say? No smartphone, no shoes with soles, no notion of weekends. Just the sound of carts on cobblestone and the smell of salted fish Dotto, and the food. That's the one thing I did look forward to. Once a week, if we'd been well behaved and brought in a good sum, Elsbeth treated us to honey cakes, thick little rounds made with rye flour, bits of dried apple, and if we were luckier, touch of clove. Closest thing we had to a medieval Pop-Tart. We'd eat them slow, tiny bites, eyes closed like it was prayer, and we needed that comfort, because the rest of the day, well, ... let's single quotes as just say, it wasn't always lace and candlelight. And that's where we'll go next. The door creaked. Merritt stirred. The town outside was waking. Let your breath slow, and I'll carry you further. The first floor smelled like wet stone and yesterday's stew. My feet, bare against the splintered steps, followed the path I knew to well down past the crooked railing, past the squeaky floorboard I always skipped, and into the hearthroom where Elsbeth was already at her table, sipping something bitter from her pewter mug. She didn't look up, just reached for a parchment and made another mark on her list. Names, I assumed, or debts, or both. That morning chill still hung in the air like a damp cloth. No fire yet, just the dim light slipping through the cracks in the shutters, slicing across the floor like gold threads on dark wool. I took up the broom and started sweeping, slow strokes, the bristles stirring dust and straw into lazy spirals. This was the quietest hour of the day before the visits, before the noise, before the performances we put on like stage actors in a never-ending tragedy, you know. I sometimes thought about the way people outside imagined our lives. Lavish, maybe sensual, dangerous even. But the truth, it was mostly cleaning, waiting, eating strange food at odd hours, and keeping our voices soft when tempers rose. Take our linens, for example. We had to boil them in lye every third day. Not for luxury, just survival. Lice were relentless, and the rats, bold. Elsbeth said one had chewed through her slippers once. I didn't ask if she was wearing them at the time, and yet there were little moments, small ones, that clung like warm embers, like when Ellen would hum as she oiled her boots, or when Merritt slipped me a leftover chunk of roasted parsnip she'd hidden from the night before, or the time we all sat around the fire and dared to laugh proper belly laughs because a nobleman had fainted mid-sentence from the smell of his own perfume. The kind of laugh that leaves you teary-eyed and breathless. That kind of joy didn't come easy, but when it did, it was sacred. One of our regulars, Jacobe, a merchant once, said we were like actresses in a play, each with her own mask. I told him mine was made of dirt and sarcasm. He laughed, left me a plum that night instead of coin. Strange barter, but fruit was rare in winter, and I savoured it like a queen with a jewelled chalice. It was around this seasonly November, maybe, that the first flakes of snow drifted past the shutters. Not thick yet, just a whisper of what was coming. Winter in our part of town was unforgiving. Fires needed feeding, bellies too, and our workload, it tripled. The cold brought more patrons. Lonely men didn't like being cold, and they paid extra to be warm and touched. One evening, Elsbeth called us all down early. We lined up in front of the hearth, where the fire finally crackled to life, casting golden ripples across the stones. She was holding a bundle wrapped in wool. Inside were 4 new shifts and dyed linen, coarse but clean. For the season, she said flatly, new clothes were a luxury. Most of mine had been patched so many times the original fabric was just a suggestion. I traced the threads of my new shift later that night, fingers ghosting across the seams. No embroidery, no frill, but it was warm, it was mine, and that was enough. Did you know that in 1363, English Parliament tried to enforce sumptuary laws? Rules about who could wear what velvet for nobles, fur for clergy, and the rest of us. Well, let's just say I wasn't breaking any laws in that shift. But still, I wondered, if I walked past a noble in the street, wrapped in his mink coat, would he see me as any less human? Probably, but here's the thing they never talk about. We weren't just bodies for rent. We were midwives, herbalists, peacekeepers, even unofficial therapists. Men told us things they wouldn't dare tell their wives or priests. I once heard a knight cry about his horse dying. Another time, a stonemason sobbed into my lap because his daughter had run off with a minstrel. I didn't ask him why that was sad. I just held him. That's all he needed. I think that's what kept me going sometimes. The sense that, in a strange and often unkind world, I was still necessary. Not respected, maybe, but needed, like salt in a stew. Speaking of witch food, again. That night, we had barley porridge, thickened with animal fat and dotted with tiny shavings of turnip. Sounds grim, I know. But when it's cold and you've been on your feet for hours, that porridge feels like a royal feast. Especially if you drop in a bit of old cheese. Melts just enough to stretch between spoonfuls like threads of gold. And there, as we sat cross-legged by the fire, bowls in hand, backs to the cold, I caught Merritt smiling into her spoon. Ellen was humming again. I leaned back against the wall, shift warm against my skin, and let the moment fill the hollow spaces in my chest. Outside, the snow thickened. Footsteps crunched in the alley. A distant lute played somewhere off-key. But earnest, and just like that, another night began. Close your eyes now, and let the sounds of the fire, the quiet rustle of linen, and the rhythm of a brothel girl's evening carry you deeper still. The bell over the door let out its usual tired clank as it swung open. A gust of winter air swept in, biting at our ankles, curling round our skirts like a cold hand searching for warmth. I glanced up from the hearth just long enough to see who entered, boots caked in mud, a fur-trimmed cloak, moth-eaten. Henrik, a regular, paid in full, smelled of boiled onions, and talked too much. Still, there were worse. He nodded toward Elsbeth, who barely acknowledged him, then sat at the bench, near the fire, warming his hands like he'd earned the privilege. I excused myself from the others and stood, stretching out the stiffness in my knees. My breath was shallow but steady, routine, ritual. Cold one tonight, Henrik muttered. I answered, voice low, even. Soup might still be warm. Want some? He grinned, revealing the gap in his front teeth. Only if you serve it. I dipped a ladle into the pot without a word, poured the thick, greasy broth into a chipped wooden bowl, and set it in front of him. He reached for it with both hands, muttering thanks, though his eyes didn't leave me for a second. Most nights, our work wasn't what people think. Sure, there were duties, but more often than not, it was conversation, hand-holding, silence. Many came here not to indulge in pleasure, but to escape the bitter cold of their lives. We offered more than warmth of the body, we gave something dangerously close to kindness, and that, sometimes, was the cruelest cut of all. I sat beside him as he ate, my feet tucked under me to shield from the chill seeping up from the floor. He told me about the new taxes, about the alderman's latest scandal, about a goat he once raised that could open latches. I nodded at the right moments, let out soft hums of amusement when needed, and gave nothing of myself away. Did you know that in Paris, around the late 1200s, there were over 100 officially registered brothels? Some even paid tax directly to the crown. Entire districts built on the backs of women like me. History remembers kings. It forgets courtesans. But oh, how many kings have knelt before women like us, whispering secrets we carry to the grave. Eventually, Henrik yawned, the kind of long, weary exhale that came with too much soup and not enough sleep. He offered 2 coppers for my company upstairs, but I declined. Not tonight. My body was tired. My soul more so. He didn't argue, just gave me a slow nod, the kind men give when they see something too tired to fight. He left with a murmur and the scent of onions trailing behind him. Upstairs, Merit was mending a stocking by candlelight, the tip of her tongue peeking from her lips in concentration. Ellen brushed her hair, slow strokes, the kind that made the strands glow like embers in the low light. I joined them, curling into my side of the shared bed, where the straw poked through, but the warmth was real. Merit's needle clinked in rhythm. Ellen hummed a soft tune from her villager lullaby, maybe, or a prayer. I stared at the ceiling. The wooden beams above were blackened from years of smoke. One of them bore a carving a heart with 2 initials. Long faded. I wondered who made it. Did she still live? Had she found something better? It struck me then that most of our lives were spent in small spaces, lit by smaller hopes. We didn't speak of the future. We didn't plan. The past was too heavy, and the future too expensive. And yet, we had each other. Threads in the same worn fabric, pulled tight by hardship, held together by warmth. Sometimes, when the cold crept in too sharp, we'd pile together under the blankets, limbs tangled, bodies pressed close, not for lust but survival, like animals in a burrow. No shame in it, just the honest truth of winter. One night, long ago, before I was left in the snow outside a guild hall, half frozen, barely conscious. A tanner's wife found me, wrapped me in a cloak, and carried me to the fire. She gave me broth, bread, and a place to sleep on the floor near her hearth. I never saw her again, but that warmth, I carried it like a flame inside me, even now. That's the kind of kindness we never forget, isn't it? Not the grand gestures, just the small warmths that keep us breathing. Outside, the wind howled against the shutters. A dog barked somewhere, down the lane. A drunk sang off-key in the alley before collapsing into quiet. And we closed our eyes and drifted. The fire downstairs smouldered low. The lantern by the door flickered in the cold draught. And sleep, like a velvet cloak, wrapped itself around us soft, heavy. Welcome. Let your breath slow now. Feel the softness of that shift. The hum of Ellen's lullaby, the weight of a day survived. There's more to tell, more warmth to find, but, for now, let your thoughts grow quiet. And as you rest, we'll walk again tomorrow into another side of this life, another flavor, another night. Close your eyes, and let the hush of the brothel, the worn wood, and the snow beyond the glass lead you into stillness. The frost arrived early that year, not with drama or thunder, but slowly, like an unwelcome guest who lingered near the doorway until someone noticed. We woke that morning to find the window panes dusted in white, their corners feathered with ice as delicate as lace. Outside, the rooftops sparkled, and the horse droppings in the alley had frozen solid nature's own cruel cobblestones. I wrapped myself tighter in my shift and tugged my sleeves down over my knuckles. Ellen still slept beside me, face pressed into the crook of her elbow, dark lashes twitching. She dreamed often and loudly, but never shared what about. I wondered, sometimes, if she dreamt of her village, or of bread that never went stale. Downstairs, the fire was nothing but ash. I poked it back to life with a bit of dry kindling and an old candlestick stub. Flames rose slowly, like someone yawning after too little rest. The scent of soot, faint and familiar, threaded through the air, mixing with the mustiness of damp stone and last night's stew pot. It was a scent I had grown to associate with safety. Over in the corner, Ilsbeth's Catmore patchwork than fur watched me with one lazy eye. I poured water from the bucket into the pot and set it over the fire. Nothing fancy, just oats today. I added a few dried apples from our ration bag and one thin sliver of salted pork, barely enough to flavor. The broth. Still, in the cold, even that small comfort was something. You ever bite into a spoonful of porridge so hot you burn your tongue and still go in for another bite? That's the kind of desperate warmth we craved. It wasn't indulgence. It was a kind of survival. Beth joined me not long after, muttering curses at the cold. Her hair, always tied with a bit of twine, looked like a crow's nest. She rubbed her hands together and offered no greeting, just reached for a mug and poured herself whatever remained of last night's bitter brew. She called it wakewater, said it was boiled nettle root and vinegar. I called it punishment in a cup. But that morning, as she sipped and squinted out the window, she said something strange. "We'll have royalty this week." I paused mid-stir. "You mean nobility?" "No," she said, her voice unusually flat. "Royalty, king's cousin or some such. Traveling north, wants local flavor." I didn't respond. What was there to say? Nobles came with demands. Royals came with consequences. That night, everything changed. We were ordered to bathe twice. Ilsbeth unlocked the cedar oil and the lavender water. Even polished our boots, though most of us would never wear them past the first hour. Ellen braided my hair tighter than usual, whispering curses under her breath. Her fingers were cold. I didn't flinch. I wore the crimson shift. It itched at the neckline, but the color made my skin look warmer. Merritt said I looked like a candle in a window. I told her she looked like she'd swallowed a candle. Her cheeks were that red from the cold. We waited downstairs like dolls on a shelf, quiet, polished, practiced. He arrived with 6 guards and a fur cloak bigger than the entire kitchen. Tall, clean-shaven, with a jeweled ring on every finger like he was trying to weigh down his own hands. His voice boomed like he was in a cathedral. "Which one's the clever one?" he asked, eyes already scanning us like livestock at market. No one moved. Ilsbeth stepped forward, smiling the way merchants do when they know they're being watched. "That be this one," she said, motioning toward me. Of course it would be. I stood, slowly, every movement measured like I'd been choreographed by a ghost. I didn't smile. Just dipped my head and looked up with the right amount of deference, not too much. Men like him could smell fear and boredom, and he preferred the latter. Easier to control. He asked questions, some innocent, some not. Wanted to know if I'd ever read a book. Wanted to know if I could dance. Wanted to know if I believed in love. That last one made me blink. "Only when it pays the rent," I said. He laughed, loud, belly deep. His guards didn't react. They'd probably heard that laugh too many times to care. And then, just like that, the royal chose to leave. Didn't stay, didn't touch. Just stood, observed, asked, and vanished. Later, as I changed back into my patched shift, I realized my hands were shaking, not from fear, not quite, more like something deeper, that odd hollow you feel when someone tries to look inside you and finds less than they expected. But it wasn't just me. The entire house buzzed with strange silence that night, like we dodged something or missed it entirely. Merritt made soup again, thicker this time, with bits of barley and turnip and that strange dried herb she always claimed was good for. Nerves, we sat close, knees touching, bowls warm in our hands. "I thought he'd choose you," Ellen whispered. "Wouldn't have mattered," I replied. And that was true. Royalty doesn't want company. They want mirrors, something to reflect their power back at them. That night, I watched the snow fall in silver slants across the cobbles, every flake a tiny rebellion against the silence of winter. The brothel, despite everything, felt more like home than anything else I'd known. And I realized, in all its strangeness, its sadness, its fleeting warmth and brutal routines, we lived. Not well, not clean, not safe, but we lived. And sometimes that was enough. As your eyes grow heavy now, let your breath settle with mine. Feel the quiet hum of winter wind at your window, the soft scratch of wool against skin, the safety of a room that still holds warmth after everything else has gone cold. And soon you'll drift, and when you do, we'll still be here waiting with the fire low, soup on the stove, and another chapter quietly unfolding. There's a quiet sort of ceremony in how we prep the table for dinner, if you can call it dinner. Cracked bowls, dented spoons, a cloth that once might have been white. We lay it all out like it means something, like ritual matters more when the food is thin. The pot on the fire was bubbling with a stew so modest it felt more like a story than a meal. Bits of cabbage, the rind of an old cheese, and a bone someone traded for a kiss last Tuesday. Ellen hummed something soft as she stirred. Not a melody, really, more like a memory barely escaping her lips. She had that look in her eyes, distant, like she was watching snow fall in a different country, in a life long buried. "Did you know," she said suddenly, "that there's a type of sausage made only in the Alps during the full moon?" I looked up, mid-slice, on a stale crust. "Is that true, or one of your moon lies?" She shrugged. "Both, maybe." The idea of a lunar sausage was oddly comforting. The world was too full of strange things for it not to be real. You'd be surprised what people can do with animal guts and herbs when they've got nothing but time, hunger, and a bit of superstition. You see, that's something about food back then. It wasn't about taste, not really. It was about filling the belly, stretching scraps into a feast, and hiding the smell of rot with just enough garlic or juniper to make you forget what you were swallowing. Elsbeth always said, "If it crunches, and it shouldn't, chew faster." Tonight's stew didn't crunch, thank the saints. We all ate in silence at first, hunched over the bowls like monks. The only sound was the scrape of spoons, the occasional sigh, and the pop of the fire spitting at the pot. Then came the knock, the kind that meant trouble. No boot against the wood, no urgency, just 3 calm taps, like a polite ghost asking to come in. I went to the door and opened it just enough to let in the cold. A woman stood there, wrapped head to toe in brown wool, face barely visible under a hood, with a satchel clutched close to her chest. Her breath steamed in front of her like smoke from a candle. "You Elsbeth?" she asked, her voice raw with travel. I shook my head. "She's sleeping." "I was told this is where I'd find work," she said, stepping forward just enough to make me lean back. "Who told you?" "Does it matter?" I looked her over, mud up to her knees, gloves too small, eyes too old for her face. I stepped aside and let her in. She didn't speak again, just settled into the warmest corner, pulled off her boot sweat and lined with. Strand offered a nod of thanks. We handed her a bowl without asking more. That's how it works here. No names at first, just heat, food, and the quiet offer of a second chance. We've all arrived like that, in one way or another. Some from tragedy, others from boredom, and a few like me from nothing at all. When I first came, I thought this would be temporary. A place to sleep, a place to eat, a way to earn without the bruises of fieldwork. But days turned into winters, and somewhere along the way, I stopped counting. People talk of choice as though it's something everyone has in equal supply. They forget that some doors don't open without cost, and others are locked tight unless you trade something precious for the key that night. While the new girl, who we eventually learned was called Runa, slept by the fire, I stayed. Up the wind outside had picked up again. You could hear the wooden signs creaking on their chains, the occasional groan from a nearby shutter knocked loose by the gust. I reached for a treat I'd hidden earlier, 2 fig rolls wrapped in cloth, gifted by a merchant who fancied himself poetic, said I reminded him of his first wife. I asked him if she hated figs too. He laughed and left without asking for anything. The rolls were stiff but sweet, and for a moment, biting into one felt like biting into a memory from a better time. Sticky, warm, and just unfamiliar enough to feel like a break from routine. They reminded me of those fruit-filled pastries made in the Holy Roman Empire, concoctions so elaborate they looked more like stained glass than food. But this was the poor woman's version. Less glory, more chew, still. Sweetness was sweetness, even if it stuck in your teeth and made you thirsty. I tore the second roll in half and set one piece beside Runa's sleeping form. Her fingers twitched, but she didn't wake. In this house, we share what little we get, even the good things. Maybe especially the good things, because in a place like this, generosity is rebellion, and tenderness, that's survival. Later, as I laid in bed, back to the wall and Ellen's cold feet pressed against my shins, I stared at the flickering shadows on the ceiling. Shapes danced like old ghosts. They whispered old lullabies, old warnings, old lies we told ourselves to fall asleep. I thought of Runa, of fig rolls, of sausage made only under a full moon, and I let my thoughts float like wood in water, aimless. Slow, soft. Let yours float to now. There's more to see, more warmth to share. But for now, let the hum of the night, the lull of the spoon in the pot, the sighs of sleeping women around the fire, carry you gently to stillness. Morning came in layers first, the low gold light on the shutters, then the creak of someone shifting in their cot, and finally, the soft clang of the chamber pot being set aside too hard. It wasn't a quiet place, not really. But if you knew the rhythm, if your ears had learned which sounds meant peace and which meant trouble, you could rest easy, or at least rest enough. Runa was up before the rest of us. She sat by the hearth, arms wrapped around her knees, staring into the ashes like they might give her answers. When I passed her on my way to fetch water, she didn't look at me, just muttered something that sounded like burnt bread and iron. It wasn't a saying I recognized, but it stayed with me. Down at the well, the cold hit sharper. The kind that gets into your teeth and makes your eyes water. My breath came out in bursts, puffing through the air like steam from a blacksmith's forge. The sky above was flat grey, like a wet wool cloak stretched across the heavens. Not quite. Threatening snow dash, just ... tired. When I came back up the hill, the baker's boy was waiting outside our door. He was maybe 13, all elbows and soot, holding a cloth-wrapped parcel with both hands like it might bite him. "For the ladies," he said, cheeks flaming red. I raised a brow. From whom? Didn't say. Just paid in coin and asked. It'd be delivered before noon. Inside the bundle, 6 warm honey cakes. Still steaming, still soft. The kind with candied peel folded inside and a dusting of ground almond across the top. A luxury. Elsbeth sniffed them, took one bite and sighed like a woman in love. We each got half. Even Runa. I took mine to the corner window, where the sun fought through the grime enough to make a pool of light on the sill. The cake was impossibly soft, the honey soaking into the crumb like it belonged there. It stuck to my teeth in a way that made you chew slower, savor longer. Let me tell you something, there are moments that don't feel medieval at all. They feel like something out of time. Like sitting barefoot on warm stones, eating cake that could have come from a modern bakery, with no noise but the faint crackle of fire and the low murmur of women waking. And in those moments, you forget. The grime under your nails, the bruises on your thighs, the way your name has started to feel like a borrowed thing. You just exist, quietly, completely. Later that day, a monk came calling, hooded, tidy, with ink-stained fingers and a nervous tick in his left eye. He claimed he'd come for Elsbeth's help in locating a lost relic. The kind of relic no one would ever miss unless they knew what it meant. He offered payment in the form of dried pears and a silver button. Elsbeth said no, but not before letting him explain. A chalice, he said, fingers twitching around a small parchment. Gilded rim, carved stem, housed once in the chapel of St. Lidwine. It was taken. During the riots, we all knew what riots he meant. A year ago, when the price of bread tripled and men took torches to the merchant square. Fires rose so high they burned the paint from the chapel walls and sent half the monks scrambling for the countryside. "Why come here?" Ellen asked, mouth full of pear. "We don't exactly stock holy things." He blinked. "You hear things from men," that earned a round of laughter. He flushed. "I meant, we know what you meant," Elsbeth said gently, showing him the door. As he left, he turned once more, eyes scanning our modest hall like he was hoping the cup would reveal itself. Just sitting on a shelf beside the pickled onions, it didn't. Still, his visit left a strange weight in the air. A reminder that even relics can be misplaced. That even sacred things end up lost in places no one expects. Maybe even in brothels. After he left, Runa asked, "What's the difference between a relic and trash?" I answered before thinking, "What someone's willing to pay for it." She nodded, like that made all the sense in the world. That night, it snowed again, harder this time. Thick flakes that muted every sound and turned the city into a dream of itself. We stood at the doorway, watching the world soften under white. Even the lantern lights seemed quieter, dulled by the drifting curtain of snow. I reached out and caught a flake on my tongue. Tasted like nothing, but somehow it still felt like something. Back inside, Ellen was telling Runa about how nobles used to eat peacock wrapped in gold leaf. Not for taste, she said, just to show they could. We all had a laugh at that. And then we went back to our bowls of lentil mush, where the only shimmer was a slick of butter and a single bay leaf floating like a raft. Somewhere in the distance, a bell rang. Low, hollow. Not for us, maybe for someone dying or someone being born. It's funny, isn't it? How life inside these walls runs parallel to everything outside. Always close, never touching. We see their cloaks flap in. The wind, smell their perfumes as they pass. But they don't see us, not really. They see the shift, the painted mouth, the borrowed grace, but not the soul who knows how to stretch flour into dumplings, or sew a hem in candlelight, or calm a drunk with nothing more than a lullaby hummed off-key. And maybe that's fine. Maybe in this quiet, hidden corner of the world, we get to keep pieces of ourselves they'll never steal. So now, as you let the quiet settle in again, think of the honey cake, of the relic no one could find, of snow falling in a city that pretends not to see its own shadows, and drift, slowly, into the hush of winter's breath. There'll be more tomorrow, but for tonight, this stillness is yours. If your eyes have grown heavy, let them stay that way. If this journey brought you any warmth at all, you're welcome to return any time. And if sleep has already found you, then rest easy. I'll be waiting when you wake. The days turn damp again, the sort of wet that creeps up your skirts. No matter how high you hitch them, it's seeped into boots, bedding, and bones, leaving us always chasing the fire with chapped hands and sore knees. Even the wood in the hearth had grown moody, refusing to catch unless sweet-talked with dry moss and a prayer that might have once belonged to a sailor. We kept close to each other during mornings like this. It wasn't so much affection as it was strategy. Body heat made up for what the draft stole. And besides, no one likes to be alone when the air smells like mildew and regret. That morning, Elsbeth passed around bowls of warm grain, porridge barely sweetened but thick enough to fill the gut. She topped mine with a sliver of dried quince, saved from a merchant's feast 2 nights prior. I let it melt on my tongue. It had the texture of old leather, but tasted faintly like a candied sunset. Sharp, soft, and fleeting. There's something about eating slowly in silence that makes you feel older than you are. Like you're part of some long tradition that doesn't need ceremony, just hunger, patience, and a bit of shared steam rising between you and your sisters. Runa, still quiet after her first week, finally spoke. Have you ever tasted a sugared violet? I blinked. Like the flower, she nodded. In the convent, on holy days, they'd crystallize them in honey. We got one each. A flower you could eat. It sounded like witchcraft and luxury all at once. I wondered what it would feel like, soft petals breaking under your teeth. The sweetness catching in your throat like a blessing too tender to hold. Of course, we had our own sweets here, just not the dainty kind. No sugar violets, no almond. Lace. Last month, a brewer's wife gifted us a whole loaf of dark bread soaked in mead and spiced with clove. It was dense as a doorstop, but tasted like a warm solstice night. The kind of thing you eat slow, while someone tells a story you only half believe. And that's what I miss. Really, not just the food, but what it does to a room. How a rare treat makes everyone generous, talkative, kind. Even Elsbeth gets soft-eyed. After a spoonful of honeyed squash. That afternoon, a boy came limping up the steps with a parchment scroll tied in blue ribbon. He couldn't have been more than 9, but he wore his importance like armor. For the house on this street with the painted sign, he said. The painted sign was just an old board with a barely visible swan on it, faded white against peeling red, but apparently it was still enough to count. The letter was from a scribe's apprentice who fancied himself a poet. He wanted to spend an evening among the muses. That's what he wrote, along with a clumsy poem about perfumed sighs and moons rising in window light. Ellen read it aloud in a voice 2 octaves higher than her own, sending us into a fit of snorting laughter. Perfumed sighs, she repeated, clutching her side. Has he met us? We smell like smoke and old stew. Still, the scroll came with a gift trapped in waxed cloth and tied with twine, slices of candied lemon, dried and rolled in sugar. We passed them around like gold coins, each of us holding our peace a little longer than we needed to, just to feel the weight of the moment. When I finally let mine rest on my tongue, it burst with sharp brightness. Sweet first, then sour enough to make my eyes sting. It made me think of summer, not just the warmth, but the suddenness of it. How it always arrived in a Russian overwhelming, too brief. I kept the peel in my mouth longer than I should have, hoping the flavor would last. Later, after the candles had been snuffed and the hall quieted to its usual chorus of breath and mattress creak, I crept out to the front stoop. The sky was overcast, thick with stars behind gauze. I pulled my shawl tighter and sat on the stone step, watching the empty street stretch out like a waiting page. Sometimes I wonder who walked these stones before us. Not the nobles or the scribes, but women like us. Women with tired feet and calloused palms, carrying bread wrapped in cloth, or whispering secrets under their breath like coins into a wishing well. We are not the first to survive this way. We won't be the last. The door creaked behind me. Runa stood there, blanket wrapped around her shoulders, eyes reflecting whatever light the moon could spare. Couldn't sleep? I asked. She shook her head. I keep hearing bells. There's a church on the wind, I said. Far off, the sound carries. She stepped out beside me, barefoot despite the chill. Feels like the kind of night you'd confess something. I smiled. You first. I used to pray for hunger at the convent, just so I'd feel something stronger than boredom. I didn't answer, just reached into my pocket and offered her the last candied lemon slice, half wrapped in a bit of linen. She took it without speaking, and together we sat there, 2 women, sharing citrus under a medieval moon, letting silence be the only story we needed. The next day was market day, and that meant noise, a roar of trade rising from the square, before the sun even warmed the rooftops. You could hear it through the shutters, the creak of carts, the clatter of hooves, the sing-song calls of sellers hawking everything from salted eels to second-hand boots. We weren't allowed down there often, not without a reason, and never alone, but sometimes Elizabeth sent us 2 by 2 for herbs or candles, or to her amusement fresh lace for the girls who'd worn theirs to threads. This time it was juniper and cloves. She was brewing something for a merchant with a cough and a guilty conscience. Ellen and I went. The moment we turned the corner, the scent of roasted chestnuts wrapped around us. Thick, warm, smoky sweet. The kind of smell that could make you forget, just for a second, who you were. A cobbler's boy juggled hot ones, wrapped in parchment, and tossed one to Elin when she smiled. He didn't ask for coin, just winked and vanished into the crowd. It was the little kindnesses that made you ache sometimes, the ones that weren't bought. We passed a barrel of pickled fish, so pungent it nearly turned my stomach, then ducked under a string of laundry to get to the spice vendor. His table was a dream, tiny sacks of color, saffron like sunset, dried mint like moss, mustard seeds clicking in their pouch like impatient insects, 2 pinches of clove, and a fistful of juniper berries. I told him, careful not to smile too much. He raised a brow. For tea, or for confession, whichever's cheaper. He laughed and handed over the goods with a wink. If you ever want to taste something wild, he added, ask for star anise. Tastes like licorice, made a deal with a ghost. We made it back just before the drizzle started, small, pin-like drops that slicked the cobblestones and made the air smell like wet wool and iron dot inside. The fire had been stoked, and Elsbeth was elbow-deep in dough. Not bread dumplings, the kind filled with chopped mushroom and onion, boiled in broth until tender. She said they came from the north, where winters lasted 6 months and women had to get creative with what little grew. Each dumpling was a pocket of steam and salt, humble and soothing. Like eating warmth itself, I sat by the hearth with my bowl, watching steam rise and curl in lazy spirals. Runa came over quietly and settled beside me, her movements smaller than usual. She was still learning how to take up space here. We all had to learn that once. You ever wonder if we'll leave this place? She asked, eyes fixed on the flames. Not often, I said. I think more about what happens if we stay. She nodded, slow, thoughtful. There's a myth people have about us that we're trapped. But truth is, most of us could leave. Not to riches or freedom, no, but to something else. Kitchens, farms, laundries. We stay because here, at least, we're not invisible. We're seen, named, spoken to. Sometimes even thanked, and once in a rare while offered something sweet. That evening, Elsbeth shared the last of her preserved gooseberries. She'd hidden them in a jar behind the salted pork, saved for a night just like this wandle, grey, heavy with quiet. The berries were tart and green, soaked in honey and rosewater. They puckered your mouth before melting into syrup on your tongue. They were for solstice, she admitted, but you lot need cheering more than the sun does. We toasted with clay cups of cider, warm and just barely fermented. And for a moment, the hall felt like a proper home. Not a place to survive in, but a place to rest. Ielin pulled out a scrap of song, something half remembered from her mother's lullabies. Runa hummed along before she even realized she knew the tune. I just listened, let the notes stitch themselves into my skin like a second shawl. Then the door banged open. Cold wind rushed in, curling around ankles and candles. A man stumbled in after it tore broad, with snow stuck in his lashes and desperation in his voice. Please, he gasped. Please, I need a place for the night. We all froze. Men didn't beg. Not here. Not like that. Elsbeth stood first, her hands still dusted in flour. You're not here for pleasure. No, he said, and sank to his knees. I've run. From soldiers, from the debtors, from God, maybe. He dropped a satchel, outspilled a broken coin purse, a crumpled letter, and doddest of all a small wrapped cake, perfectly tied with green twine. I reached for it before I could think. Inside, almond sponge with sugared fig. The scent hit like a memory, something festive, something forbidden. The kind of thing you'd only taste if your master was generous, or your lover was guilt-ridden, or if fate herself blinked and let something good fall into your lap. We let him stay, not in our beds, just by the hearth, wrapped in old linens, shivering like a beaten hound. He didn't speak again that night. just clutched the edge of the rug and stared at the fire like it owed him answers. Before bed, I took a sliver of that cake and placed it beside his hand. No thanks needed. Not every kindness needs to be seen. The snow had started by dawn, slow and lazy, fat flakes spiraling through the still air, landing on windowsills like quiet warnings. The kind of snow that didn't rush to cover the earth but took its time, letting each flake pick the perfect resting place. We knew what it meant. Cold days ahead, empty pockets, short tempers. But it also meant fewer visitors, and fewer visitors meant more quiet. For some of us, it was a relief. By mid-morning, the man from the night before was gone, left nothing but a shallow indent in the rug, and a faint scent of smoke on the linens. The bit of almond cake was untouched. Or maybe not. Tellin swore she saw a corner missing. Either way, he took nothing else. Not even the chance to say goodbye. Runa said nothing about it. She just wrapped the rest of the cake in cloth and tucked it onto the top shelf. For a real emergency, she murmured. By noon, the house was filled with the smell of simmering broth and wet wool. The younger girls hung damp stockings by the hearth, giggling at steam rising from their toes. Elsbeth took it as a good omen. Laughter means warmth, she said, stirring a pot that smelled of turnip and something almost like chicken. And warmth means no frostbite this year, Riff. We're lucky we didn't have much meat left. Few bones, scraped of most their worth, and some dried fish from the last coastal delivery. But you can do a lot with bones, if you know how to boil them right. The broth thickened slowly, turning from water to something golden, a bit cloudy and rich with promise. It was Ellen who started the guessing game. If you could eat anything right now, anything from anywhere, what would it be? I said roasted. Pears soaked in mulled wine with spiced cream. Runa whispered honeyed rye bread with melted cheese, the kind that strings when you pull it apart. Elsbeth raised an eyebrow. Roasted pheasant, stuffed with apples and rosemary, and a cup of black cherry cordial. Ellen grinned. I'd settle for a pie with crust that doesn't crumble like parchment. We laughed, not because it was funny, but because hunger always makes you dream out loud. And there's something about talking through your cravings that makes the lack hurt a little less. Later, just before dusk, a traveling performer passed through. He didn't come for pleasure or pay or even shelter. Just walked up to the threshold and asked if we had ears for a tale. We did. He sat by the fire with his cloak still dusted in snow. Thin man, twitchy eyes, voice like melted wax, low, thick, warm. He spoke of the kingdom of Bohemia, where sausages hung from trees in spring festivals and children chased ribbons of honey poured from rooftops. He described a wedding feast where the cake was as tall as a man, layered with crushed almonds, dried dates, and violet sugar. Violet sugar again. It was the second time that week we'd heard of it. Some things follow you when you least expect. Did you see it with your own eyes? Runa asked. He smiled without teeth. No, miss. But I've eaten it in my dreams. And that's nearly the same. He left behind a pouch of roasted chickpeas, dusted with ash and fennel. Not much, but enough to chew thoughtfully while the evening settled into our bones. That night, as we all curled up beneath mismatched blankets, I heard Runa whispering a prayer, not to saints or gods or even to the night itself, just a soft murmur like she was speaking to someone long gone, or maybe to herself. She ended with a word I hadn't heard before. Spasibo, she said, foreign and soft. When I asked her later, she told me it meant thank you in her grandmother's tongue. "I say it every night," she said, "even on the bad ones, especially on the bad ones." I started saying it too, quietly, to no one. Just a little sound before sleep, tucked beneath my breath like a keepsake. Some nights, when the wind howled and the shutters rattled, I'd press my hand to the floor and whisper it into the cracks, as if the wood might remember, as if kindness, once spoken, could linger like scent. One afternoon the next week, a merchant brought us a gifter, whole wheel of cheese wrapped in linen, cold from the journey and sharp as heartbreak when we finally sliced it open. It crumbled on the tongue, dry and tangy, tasting faintly of pine and ash. He said it was a gift for saving his brother from loneliness. His brother being, presumably, the man who'd fled the soldiers. A quiet thank you wrapped in dairy dot. We feasted that night, cheese on bread, cheese with broth, cheese warmed by the fire and eaten off fingertips. It made us giggle, it made us foolish, it made us human again. And when the candles burned low and the coals blinked like sleepy eyes, I leaned my head back and listened to the silence between snores. In that space, I swore I could hear it again, that word, that SPASIBO. Whisper passed from one girl to the next, not spoken aloud but carried on breath, soft as the snow falling again outside. And so we drifted, full for once, not just of food, but of something quieter, something slower, gratitude, perhaps, or maybe just peace. The wind had changed. You could tell by the way it pushed against the shutters, like a tap and more like a shove. Impatient and sharp, the kind of wind that made doors creak open on their own and sent smoke curling sideways out of chimneys. We felt it before we saw it. That shift in the air that makes you pull your shawl tighter, even when the fire's still warm. Elsbeth noticed first. She always did. "Snow's done," she muttered, adjusting her bodice without looking up. "Storm's coming next. The kind that takes roofs with it, if you're not careful." The fire crackled in agreement. She handed me a pot wrapped in cloth fermented cabbage she'd left to sit too long in the cellar. "Take this down to the baker," she said. "He owes me 3 rolls and a favor." I didn't argue. You don't argue with a woman who knows how to trap rats with a boot and a stare. Outside, the wind nipped at every exposed bit of skin. It tasted like metal and ash and made your ears burn with cold. But it was the scent drifting down from the baker's chimney that truly stopped Mirage. Dense, smoky sweet. Not just bread, not just yeast. Something else. Something indulgent. When I arrived, the baker was bent over a tray of small, round pastries, dusted with powdered sugar. He saw me and grinned. "Caught me mid-sin," he said. "Testing a new recipe. Want a bite?" He offered one of the little things, warm to the touch, flaking at the edges. I took a cautious nibble. Inside date paste. Dark, sticky, earthy sweet, like molasses had been taught manners. The outside crumbled like fine sand between my teeth. "Closest thing to luxury I've tasted since summer," I murmured. He nodded. "Based it on a Moorish recipe. Came in through Spain. They call it mobile. Of course, it had a fancy name. Things that taste that good always do." I brought back the rolls, still hot, wrapped in a cloth that smelled like wheat and smoke. Ellen tore hers apart before she even sat down. Runa waited until her fingers stopped trembling from the cold. We spent the afternoon tucked close to the hearth, feeding kindling to the fire and ourselves to the quiet. Someone mentioned the date pastry, and just like that, the room filled with soft talk of exotic treats, saffron rice, candied orange peel, almond milk sweetened with cinnamon. We'd never tasted half those things, but we'd heard of them, whispered between guests, or muttered by traveling tradesmen. We pieced them together from scraps of stories, like patchwork recipes passed down in secret. Then, just before nightfall, Elizabeth did something rare. She opened her chest, the one beneath her bed. We gathered close, mind you, or she'd swat you away like flies, but close enough to see what she pulled out. A jar of preserved quince, thick and golden like sun-cooked honey, a pouch of dried plums, and a single, small cone of molded sugar. It was the sugar that made us gasp. Perfectly shaped, smooth at the tip, and stamped with a faded emblem, gift from a bishop's wife. She explained, as if that made any sense. He kept a mistress in our back room. She knew. Paid me to keep him fed, not happy. She broke the cone with a hammer and passed the shards around like communion wafers. It was gritty, sweet, yes, but with something else, a bitter edge, almost smoky, not perfect, but beautiful and rare. I held my peace on my tongue and let it melt, slowly, like it might carry me somewhere warmer. We didn't speak much that night, didn't need to. The wind howled and the boards groaned, and still the fire held. That was enough. That was enough, that in the memory of sweetness dissolving in the quiet, the next morning began with silence. No footsteps in the street, no distant clatter from the smithy, not even the usual groan of someone stirring under thin blankets. Just the long hush of frost settling deep into the cracks of the world. We stayed in our beds longer than usual, wrapped like roast hens in every threadbare layer we owned. Even the floor refused to creak. When I finally stood, the boards bit at my feet, sharp with cold. Like the wood itself was angry. Ellen was already by the hearth, coaxing the coals back to life. Her breath fogged the air like a ghost drifting from her mouth. "We've got one candle left," she said. The others melted crooked. Runa emerged next, clutching the sugar shard from the night before like it was a talisman. "I saved mine," she whispered. "I'm waiting for the right moment." Right moment, as if sweetness had its own calendar. Elizabeth surprised us all when she handed over a bit of dried beef and an onion. "Make something of it," she said, turning away. "Let's feel full again, even if it's a lie." So we cooked. Not much, just a stew thickened with crumbs and colored by hope. But when you stir it long enough, it starts to smell like memory, like winter in a better year, like someone might walk through the door at any moment with warm boots and better news. Runa added the smallest shaving of her sugar to the pot. A reckless gesture, or maybe it was brave. Either way, it changed the broth. Gave it a depth it didn't earn, a sweetness that came not from abundance, but from choosing to give when you have nothing left. As we ate, the wind began to pick up again. This time not sharp, but deep. It groaned, low and full, like a beast yawning outside the walls. I asked Elizabeth if the storm would last. She didn't answer right away, just stared into her bowl like it held answers. "Then, there's an old saying," she muttered. "When the winds blow from the west for 3 days straight, the fourth brings fire or frost. We'll know by morning." No one asked which one she preferred. That night, after most of the girls had drifted to sleep, Runa and I sat by the window, watching frost bloom on the glass like silver vines. She spoke about her village, how her grandmother used to press dried rose petals into her clothes, so every time she opened the trunk, the air would smell like June. I told her about a neighbor I once had, who baked apple tarts so often the scent clung to her hair like perfume. We talked in whispers, trading old scents like coins. When we ran out of memories, we fell quiet, but sleep didn't come right away. So we listened to the house breathing, the wood sighing, the wind draping itself over the roof like a second skin. And somewhere in that silence, we heard a knock, just one. Then nothing. We looked at each other, waited. Then it came again. Not loud, not urgent, just a simple, steady tap. Elsbeth was first to the door. She opened it without a word. A boy stood there, barefoot, shivering, no older than 10 in his hands, a satchel, greasy and patched. Inside he had 3 boiled eggs. One was cracked, the other 2 intact. He didn't speak, just held them out like a peace offering from some broken kingdom. Elsbeth took them. She didn't smile, just said, "Get inside before your toes turn black." He ate by the fire with shaking hands. Later, when he finally looked up, he asked, "Do you have jam?" Runa snorted softly, "No, sweetheart. But we've got sugar in our dreams." And I swear, he smiled at that, a real smile. The kind you only see when someone remembers they're still alive. He stayed for 3 days, didn't speak much, didn't sleep much either. Just curled in the corner by the hearth with his knees tucked up and his eyes half closed, like a cat pretending not to listen. We never asked where he came from. That's a rule in places like ours. Ask only what someone's willing to give. On the second morning, he helped Ellen stack firewood, not because anyone told him to, but because he saw her struggling and decided to move. That earned him a thick slice of bread and the soft spot on Runa's blanket by the 3rd night. He laughed at a joke Elsbeth made. That's how we knew he was staying, whether for a while or for always. We let him. The storm outside stretched into something more, the kind of cold that slips into your lungs and lives there. Ice rimmed the inside of the window panes like the house was holding its breath. But inside, we were warmer than we had been in weeks. The stew stretched further than it should have. The fire burned longer than we expected. Ellen swore the kindling wasn't shrinking at all, like the wood had made a quiet deal with the gods of scarcity. That evening, Elsbeth brought out a jar we'd never seen before. Inside was something dark and glossy, sunk beneath syrup, plums, whole, wrinkled, and soaked in whatever liquor had survived the fall harvest. "Saved these for midwinter," she said, spooning one into each of our bowls. "But I'm thinking now's as close to mid as we'll get." The boy's eyes went wide. He held his plum gently, like it might vanish if he blinked. "They're sweet," Runa told him, "but they bite back." And she was right. The taste filled your mouth like a bell rung deep underwater, rich, a little sharp, a little sad, like someone else's memory passed down through flavor. Afterward, the boy fell asleep with plum syrup on his chin and a smile tugging at his lips. I watched him breathe and wondered how many times I'd done the same, fallen asleep hungry, or cold, or frightened, and woken to something soft, something stolen from despair. Sometimes, all it takes is a plum to believe in people again. Elsbeth cleaned the spoons with hot water and prayer. Not a real prayer, just the kind whispered through chapped lips when you've run out of cleverness. Then, as the candles grew stubby and the shadows stretched long, she told us a story. Not a funny one, not even a scandalous one. It was about her first winter in the house. How the snow had blocked the door and a rat chewed through her boot while she was wearing it. How a stranger showed up, offered her a sweet bun, and disappeared before morning. He left no name, she said, just the scent of sugar and rosemary. Haven't smelled either since. We all sat quiet after that, because it's the scent that stays, isn't it? Not the words, not the face, not even the food itself. It's the smell that climbs into your memory and refuses to leave. Later, when everyone else had gone to bed, I stayed behind. The fire had dimmed to its red heartbeat, and the wind outside had finally stilled as if the whole world was listening for something in the hush. I reached into my pocket, pulled out the last shard of sugar I'd hidden away 2 nights before. I placed it on my tongue and closed my eyes. It melted slowly, and in that sweetness, I remembered everything. The bread that steamed in my hands, the plum that bit like wine, the boy's small laugh, Runa's breath beside me, the smell of baked dates, the quiet knock at the door. They were all still with me, tucked behind my teeth, held in warmth, carried into sleep. And as I drifted into the hush of that long night, I could almost hear it again passed between lips, breathed out into the dark. The bells came before the men, not the usual church bells, soft and slow, but high, frantic clanging from the east tower. It meant someone had spotted riders, more than a dozen moving fast, and wearing too much metal for it to be friendly. We knew that sound. Everyone in town did. It didn't matter if it was tax collectors, mercenaries, or nobles on their way to a wedding feast. That kind of speed always meant trouble, and the bells weren't asking, they were warning. Inside our crooked little house, Elsbeth was already grabbing linens. Not to hide or to wave surrender, but to sell. Foreigners pay double when they think it's exotic, she muttered, yanking embroidery off the shelf, even if it's just beer stains and bad stitching. Ellen helped her wrap dried lavender into tiny pouches. You think they'll want us? Elsbeth didn't answer. She didn't need to. They always wanted us. By the time the horses thundered through the square, we were lined up near the entrance like baked goods in a window, flushed, polished, and half smiling. There were 15 of them. One wore a wolf pelt draped over his shoulders, even though the sun had started climbing. Another had gold thread laces in his boots and smelled like nutmeg and blood. But it was the youngest one who spoke first. He pointed at our bread loaf cooling by the fire and said, "That smells like the gods we forgot to pray to." Then, without asking, he sat down and took a bite. His eyes closed. What is this?" "Caraway," I said, softly, "and honey scraped from the comb." He nodded slowly. "Closest thing to peace I've had in a month." That's how they entered, not like invaders, but like men too tired to fight. They paid in coin, at least at first, tossed silver into Elsbeth's hands like they were skipping stones, ate like wolves, laughed like thunder, and drank. They drank. By dusk, one of them started weeping over a boiled egg, muttering something about a girl named Annika, and how her hair used to smell like strawberries. No one asked questions. We just kept the ale flowing and our faces soft. I brought out the last of the preserved apricots, soaked in wine and cinnamon, sweet enough to make even their bruises forget what caused them. "Where'd you learn to make these?" the youngest one asked me. "From a woman who said sugar could save your soul," I replied. He chuckled. "Then I'm halfway redeemed." Later, when the candles burned low and the men began to fall asleep wherever their bodies landed, pulled me aside. "We should hide the rest of the sweets," she whispered. "They'll wake hungry and drunk." She wasn't wrong, but I looked around at their scattered cloaks, the snores like thunder, The broken heel on Ellen's shoe where a man had stepped too close, and I said, "Let them have it." She blinked. "All of it. All of it. Let them remember this place, not for the bodies they borrowed, but for the warmth that stayed in their mouths." It was a risk. Kindness usually is. But as I pressed the last sugar plum into the youngest soldier's hand, his fingers closed around mine, not with force, but with quiet. "Thank you," he whispered, "for not flinching, and that was more valuable than coin." The next morning, the house smelled like horses, sweat, and something vaguely roasted. Someone had left their gauntlets in the basin. Another had bled a little into the breadbasket. All in all, a fairly polite visit by winter standards. Elsbeth was already counting coins, muttering numbers under her breath, like they were prayers she didn't quite believe in. "Could last us through spring," she said. "If none of you get any bright ideas about generosity." Ellen laughed. Too late. The men had gone before sunrise, just as silently as they came. No loud farewells, no broken chairs, just a pile of ashes where they'd warmed themselves, and a whittled piece of wood left on the windowsill shaped like a sparrow. The youngest one, I was sure. For a few days, the house felt lighter, as if the presence of danger had swept out the stale air and left room for something else. We used part of the silver to buy barley and chestnuts from the market. Ellen roasted the chestnuts until their skins curled back like the petals of sleepy flowers. The scent filled the room with a warm kind of memory, the kind that sits quietly beside you and doesn't ask for anything. "Closest thing to joy in a shell," Runa said, popping one open with her thumbs. "It's like edible fireplace crackle." And it was. They were warm, sweet, and slightly smoky, perfect for evenings when the cold slunk back in like a sulking cat. I sat near the fire, holding one between my fingers, feeling the heat soak into my skin. Sometimes I think our entire life was made up of little pockets of warmth, spices in stew, embers under blankets, steam rising from bowls, and the rest was just what we had to get through to reach those moments. Elsbeth called it comfort by theft, stealing joy from the jaws of hardship. But I think it was more like crafting a kind of magic, low and slow. That week, the boy who had knocked on our door, Finn, we'd learned, began speaking more. He told us about the monastery, the one that had fed him barley cakes when he was smaller. How he used to sneak into the kitchens just to smell the dried pears hanging from the rafters. "I didn't even want to eat them," he said. "I just liked the smell, like sunshine got stuck in the fruit." We listened, not because his story was grand, but because it reminded us what mattered: scent, warmth, being known. And maybe that's why, on the 5th night after the riders had gone, we decided to make something entirely indulgent, something sweet, for no reason, a dessert, not a holiday, not a guest, just us. So we made fritters flour egg, a bit of dried apple fried in a pan until golden, then dusted with the very last pinch of ground cinnamon. It felt reckless, it felt right. The fritters sizzled and puffed in the oil, like little pillows of defiance. Ellen burned her thumb, flipping one. Runa dropped hers on the floor and ate it anyway. Finn licked the cinnamon from his lips and sighed, so deeply you'd think he'd been waiting for that taste since the day he was born. And me. I sat back and watched them, all of them lit by firelight and sweet air, their cheeks pink from heat and sugar, and I thought, this is what people should remember when they speak of Dus. Not the brothel, not the men, not the coins, but the fritters, the laughter, the way the air shimmered with scent and sound. warm kind of rebellion, an edible promise that we would not be forgotten. In shadow, not in shame. We would be remembered in cinnamon. That fritter night became a kind of ritual. Once a week, or whenever we felt the chill digging in too deep, we'd fry whatever scraps we had into golden little things and eat them until our fingers glistened. Finn called them armor in crumbs, and somehow it stuck. Even Elsbeth treated flour like currency, begun hoarding bits of dried fruit, pinches of spice, just so we could keep making them. Every house needs a weapon, she said one night, wiping sugar from her sleeves. Ours just happens to smell like apples. It was during one of those warm, fritter-scented evenings that a visitor arrived. Not a soldier. Not a man with rough hands and coin between his teeth. A girl. She couldn't have been older than 14. Thin as kindling. Eyes too large for her face, and wrapped in a threadbare cloak that might have once been green. She didn't knock, just stood at the doorway like she wasn't sure if this was a house or a dream. We brought her in without a word. No questions, no stares, just warmth. And Fritter's Runa wrapped her in the thickest blanket we had. Finn gave her the last fritter, still hot. The girl blinked, startled, then bit into it like someone who hadn't eaten in days. The moment she chewed, her whole face changed, like something inside had remembered softness. We didn't ask for her name until the third day, and even then, it came in a whisper. Leader. She didn't say where she'd come from, but we knew the signs. Dirty heels, silence where words should be, eyes that tracked shadows too carefully. She had fled something, and we had become the kind of place people fled to. That realization hit me on the fourth night, as I watched Elsbeth tuck an extra blanket around the girl's feet. We weren't just surviving anymore. We were holding space for stories, for scars, for sweetness. Our house, once a place of transaction, had become a pocket of stillness. A little rebellion wrapped in linen and cinnamon. When spring finally cracked the frost and let in the scent of mud and flowers, we took the barrels out into the sun, cleaned the floors with lemon balm, aired out the beds, and baked. Oh, how we baked. The last of the root vegetables went into pies, thin and savory, tucked with wild herbs and a drizzle of honey. Lyda helped slice onions. She cried, of course, but she didn't complain, just kept working, eyes squinting, cheeks wet, knife steady. She's one of us now, Ellen said, and we all nodded because she was. Later that week, a man came to the door, clean boots, clean beard, no scars, said he was looking for his niece. Said her name was Lida. Her hands froze on the bucket she was carrying. He offered coin, gold.ils. Beth didn't even blink. She's not here. He narrowed his eyes. I was told this was where women go when there's nowhere else. That's true, Elsbeth said, but we decide when they leave. He didn't like that answer, but he also didn't like the way Runa stood behind him, holding a broom like it was blessed by something mean, so he left. Lida cried that night, not because she missed him, but because we didn't give her back. Thought, people don't keep girls like me, she whispered. I took her hand, sticky with dough. We're not people, I said softly. We're women, and we keep each other. The next morning, she woke up early and made fritters by herself, burned. Half of them, but the ones she got right, well, they tasted like home. And as the sun rose over our crooked little house, with flour in the air and a breeze curling through the open windows, I couldn't help but think, if this is what survival looks like, then let it be sweet. The rains came. Slow that year, not with drama, but with a quiet insistence seeping into the wood, curling into the corners of the house like it had paid rent. The kind of damp that didn't splash or storm, just settled in your bones and made itself at home. Everything smelled like wet stone and wilted herbs. Even the bread struggled to rise. We began drying lavender in bigger bundles, not for scent this time, but to hang in corners to keep the mildew off the walls. Finn carved hooks out of driftwood. Ellen lined the windows with wool scraps. We became weatherproofing experts out of necessity, not design. This house wasn't built for seasons, Elspeth muttered, jamming cloth into a crack in the floor. It was built for secrets, and she wasn't wrong. The floor slanted west. The beams groaned when the wind turned, and the hearth only drew properly if you begged it in 3 different languages. But it was ours, and like anything you loved too long, we knew how to hold it together with thread and spit, and the hope that tomorrow would be drier. Lida took to the kitchen like she'd been born there. She started making broth from beetroots and wild garlic, adding tiny barley dumplings she called cloud eggs, though they looked more like sleeping mice. They didn't taste like much, but they were warm, and sometimes that was enough. We'd sit at the hearth bowls in our laps, letting the steam kiss our cheeks while rain sang its lullaby against the roof. "You think people will remember us?" Finn asked one evening, chewing slowly. "Who?" Ellen replied. "The world." He nodded. "I hope not," she said with a shrug. "We'd be a terrible myth." But I disagreed. I thought of the fritters, the lavender, the way we turned scraps into stories. There was something there. Not legend, exactly, but memory. The kind that hides in kitchens and clings to wooden spoons. That night, I wrote names on the underside of the table, just in case. Mine.elin, single quotes us.il, s.fin, single quotes us.even, the name of the girl who once wept over an egg, because someday the house might fall, or the rain might take it, or someone might rip up the floor to build something newer, cleaner, quieter, and I wanted them to know. We lived here, we mattered, not because we were saints, not because we were scandalous, but because we found warmth. In a world that kept trying to make us cold, by the second week of rain, our fingertips were permanently pruned, and even the rats began looking for somewhere drier to gossip. The leak above the bread oven had turned into a full conversation drip. Drip, drop like some soggy bard with terrible rhythm to fight the gloom. Elin decided we needed a feast. Not for anyone, she said. Not for guests, just us. Finn looked up from the hearth where he was poking half-heartedly at damp logs. With what? Our pantry looks like it's been robbed by ghosts. Exactly why it has to be now, she insisted. Before we forget what joy tastes like. Elspeth gave her one of those withering looks, the kind that could salt a field. But half an hour later, she was elbow deep in the larder, pulling out pickled pears and dried fish, like she was auditioning for a stormy version of a miracle. We called it the soggy supper. There was beetroot mash, barely pink anymore, but hearty, hard cheese cracked into chunks with a knife older than the town bell. A flat oat cake, scorched in places, made entirely of defiance. And then there were the turnip chips, thin, crispy, dusted with something, Runa swore, was powdered rosemary but might have been lint. Don't ask, she said, just chew. We laughed, not the tired kind, not the polite kind, but real, belly-deep laughter. The sort that only comes when you realize you're still here, even after the world has tried to soak you silent. And for dessert, chestnut spread, swirled on rye crust, with a single candied almond balanced on each one like a crown. Finn ate his too fast and got cinnamon up his nose. Lida tried to eat hers with a spoon. Elsbeth just stared at hers for a long time before whispering, "I never thought we'd get to silly food." Silly food, that was exactly it. Not luxurious, not elaborate, but unnecessary in the best way. And maybe that was the real feast. Knowing we could still choose joy even when the walls wept. That night, we danced to no music, just the sound of our feet on damp floorboards and the creak of the ceiling above us. Lida twirled with a broom. Ellen spun in circles until she fell over, shouting something about vertigo being holy. I closed my eyes and swayed, arms around the air, pretending it was the warmth I used to know as a girl before this house, before the choices, before the bargains we'd made just to stay fed. And in that flicker of movement, I felt it again. Not escaped but presence. The sacredness of silliness. The holiness of half-burnt bread and laughter-shaped air. And when we collapsed together on the rugs, sweaty and breathless and still slightly damp, Runa whispered, "This house isn't leaking. It's crying with joy." We all howled, but none of us disagreed. It took nearly a month for the rain to stop. When it finally did, it didn't come with fanfare, just a single morning where the sky looked a little less like boiled wool and more like a sigh. We stepped outside, as if stepping onto the moon. Everything glistened. Leaves, stones, even the thatch sparkled like it had secrets. Finn ran barefoot across the grass just to feel the difference. "It smells like the world changed its shirt," he shouted. And it did. The mud had settled into a soft carpet. The brothel, if you could still call it, that stood crooked and damp but proud. And inside, we were planning, not for guests, not for coin, but for planting. Lida had found a patch of ground behind the shed where sunlight pooled like soup. She'd scratched it out with a broken ladle and declared it perfect for food or flowers, whichever forgives us first. We started small carrot seeds, barley from the pantry, bits of garlic we'd forgotten behind the bread tins. Ellen wrote labels on flat stones. Runa chased crows off with a ladle. Elsbeth watched it all from the porch with a blanket on her knees, muttering about how none of us knew a damn thing about dirt. But I think she liked it. I think she liked watching us put things in the ground, not because we needed them right now, but because we believed we'd still be here when they came up. Hope, after all, isn't always loud. Sometimes it's just a girl whispering to a seed, or a boy wiping his muddy hands on his shirt and calling it progress, or a woman painting eggshells with soot and honey and hanging them in the window to keep bad spirits away. That was Ellen's idea. "It's ancient," she said. "Probably, but it looks pretty." We didn't care if it worked. It made us feel protected. And maybe that was enough. That night, we made one last round of fritters, to mark the rain's end, to mark the planting, to mark maybe that this place, this odd, damp, stubborn house was no longer just where people went when there was nowhere else. It was a home, and not just because of the beds, or the bread, or the fire, but because of the names, scratched under tables, the laughter soaked into the beams, the quiet moments where someone handed you a sweet and didn't ask anything in return. After the last fritter was gone, we sat in silence, not heavy silence, the soft kind, the kind that tucks you in, and as the wind carried in the scent of new shoots and old rain, I felt something settle in me, not peace, exactly, but presence, the knowledge that we had been real, that we had mattered, and that even if the world forgot our faces, it would remember the warmth we made. In the dark, in the damp, in the silence, we had been a light, dot flickering, sweet and true. May these memories guide you into peaceful dreams. If you drifted off, let me know below. Sweet dreams. This is boring history for sleep. Signing off. Soft whisper. Good night. Boring history for sleep. Signing off.